Remember the slow motion videos that we had here last week during Crossbow Appreciation Month, and done a couple of follow-up videos on that topic. I am loving the slow motion. That's kind of the theme of Crossbow Appreciation Month so far. I didn't plan it that way. It didn't start out that way. It just sort of happened, right? But nonetheless, I've had a couple of comments that I want to follow up on this week. Jeff Hayes, 1968, says, love the slow motion. Learned something too. Seems the drop in flight curve does not come on until late in the shot, meaning 2/3 of the flight would be on one pin or one reticle of the scope. In other words, contrary to logic, arrows don't drop like stones. And many of us would get a good shot on one pin or dot from close up out to say 30 yards. This isn't something I've discussed an awful lot in videos because it's not my style of hunting. It is not part of the Death by Bunjie crossbow method. This is something, however, that some people do use as far as crossbow hunting is concerned. I'm familiar with it because friends of mine hunt that way, right? Some people do. And compound bow hunters, some of them hunt that way, right? The concept is discussed in my book too. I'm gonna grab that book real quick. The Death by Bunjie crossbow method. It's actually discussed a couple of times in this book. Death by Bunjie Axiom. Distance and accuracy go hand in hand. When sighting and in practicing, use your rangefinder to learn and shoot exact distances. You need to be as close as possible to exact yardages in the field as well to make accurate shots. One other method I want to mention here in that book is the concept of single pin shooting. Flat shooting, right, using one pin or one reticle out to a certain yardage is attractive to me because it doesn't require you to move your hands and, range find a deer. You don't need a rangefinder necessarily. You don't need to turn a knob on an HHA optimizer or anything like that. You don't need to turn the turret on your Husqvarna scope or anything like that. Instead, it's just that one reticle. Use the 20 all the time. And like I wrote in the book, it typically accepts the fact that most deer are shot within 30 yards, and for that reason, only one reticle is needed. If the deer is beyond 20 yards, you hold over. You aim a little bit higher to compensate for the effect of gravity and air resistance. If the deer is closer than 20 yards, then you hold under. You aim a little bit lower. You use the 20-yard center crosshair in both instances. Many compound bow hunters use a similar method in the northeastern deer woods, I am told. I don't have any experience with compound bows, vertical bows, but nonetheless, that's what I'm told. My criticism of that method of hunting, and the reason I don't shoot that way in the backyard, the 60-yard backyard, and the reason I don't shoot that way in the field is because arrows simply don't shoot flat. There's nothing flat about this. There is a trajectory to all arrows, even the fastest of our arrows. There is an arc. All archery equipment lobs arrows at the target. The longer that arrow is in the air, the more time gravity has to pull it down. No crossbows shoot flat. All arrows have an arc. Faster crossbows just shoot less arcy than slower forms of archery equipment. But here's the important thing to remember about that arc. It isn't a simple bell curve where it goes up and then down. That's not how this works. The flight path of an arrow is an arc. If there was no air resistance and only gravity, gravity would accelerate the arrow toward the ground at the same speed that the crossbow propels the arrow horizontally. Without air resistance, the arc would be perfect and even on both ends. However, because air resistance is slowing the arrow down, the horizontal traveling of the arrow is also slowed. Gravity is still pulling down, but the arrow is getting there more slowly, which means gravity has more time to act on that arrow and pull it down. Thus, the arc gets sharper toward the end of the flight path. This is true for any distance, but it is a lot more noticeable at longer distances. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here because I'm thinking about that video that we saw of the original Bunjie, the OB in the backyard, in the 60-yard backyard. That 55-yard shot, you might not notice this at 20 yards, but the 55-yard shot sort of at an angle going crossways across the entire lawn. We get to see that arc, and it almost looks as though it's flat going out, and then it drops incredibly at the tail end. In fact, it looks like it's flat out to 40 yards or so. In the last 10-15 yards, it really drops off to hit the target. Perfect bullseye, I might add. What I can do, and this was suggested in my conversations with Jeff Hayes, one of the things he suggested is maybe we could put a ruler on that screen. So what I've done is actually put a graphic on that screen. The red dot on the left is on the field point. And the arrow, the point of that arrow, is actually on the target where the arrow eventually makes contact. You got to take into account the angles of this isn't perfect, right? I didn't shoot this so that I would have mathematically perfect angles. This is just there to demonstrate the concept. But if you look at this, already we can see that the arrow points at a different angle from the line, right? The line that I've added on the screen is perfectly straight from that field point all the way to the target. But the arrow is pointing up. You can see the barrel of the crossbow is pointing up. The two lines don't match up. The line of that arrow and the line on the screen do not match up. They aren't in the same direction exactly. And now that I've got that on there, I'll play it and we'll watch that arrow go, and we can see it goes up in the air incredibly high. It's not going toward the target, which we know. Instead, it's going over the target, and then gravity pulls it down. And isn't it amazing that we have equipment, scopes and crossbows, arrows, all the stuff working together to take into account what that arc is going to be, so that even though it's not ever pointed directly at the target, it still hits the target. All this stuff sort of works together. That's pretty cool. I want to jump in here with one other interesting observation. Check this out. If you notice, what I'll do is I'll put a line on here. Crossbows, string going forward, hitting those bumpers or coming to rest, pushing the arrow down range, is forward recoil. Not like a rifle. You shoot the rifle and that explosion takes place inside the chamber, and that's propelling you back while it's propelling the bullet forward, right? So you've got that recoil. We're familiar with that. With crossbows, traditionally the thinking is forward recoil. Really what you're feeling is the arrow gets pushed down range and that string goes forward, hits the front of the crossbow and pulling the crossbow forward. So you got that forward recoil. But watch what we have here. Now this crossbow, Bunjie is strapped in to the Bog Death Grip tripod. It's like a vise. It's actually sitting in there, cranked right down nice and tight so it doesn't move, and that way I can hold that crossbow perfectly steady as I'm shooting. But watch what happens as I pull the trigger. What I've done is put a line, our arrow, I've moved it so that it's on and lined up perfectly with the arrow. So it's lined up with the shooting rail, with the flight groove, perfectly. Watch what happens as I pull the trigger. Boom, the arrow goes, but the barrel lifts up, just like a rifle. It's rocking back in that vise, in that Bog Death Grip. That arrow actually leaves the crossbow and the crossbow's lifting up, right? Part of the reason for that is because these are pretty heavy arrows. So the reason for that is inertia. An object in motion tends to stay in motion, like that arrow going down range, but an object at rest tends to stay at rest. So it takes a lot of energy from that crossbow to push that arrow off the rail and get it going. So while it's doing that, it's pushing back against it because it's pushing so hard on that arrow. So the heavier arrows, you're going to notice more of that recoil. Other people have commented on that before. This isn't just me. But back to the flat shooting, what if we put an arrow on here and we sort of look through the video and we find out the point at which that arrow starts to drop? What if we put an arrow, a point there? What does the arrow do in that straight line? And we shoot, and that's out to about 40 yards. We see that arrow skimming the top of it. And that distance, that it's harder to measure at distance because the arrow's leaving us, it's further away. But we can still see that arrow never touches that line. It's not straight on that line, it's above that line. So it is always above it, and there's an arc, even within that so-called flat distance, there's an arc, and the arrow is sort of going over that, right? It's never on that line. There's an arc over that line from one end to the other. That could be our flat distance, I suppose. Or we could cut that in half and sort of go to the, sort of split the difference. I talk about that in my book as well. I don't like that, right? Because if we look at it, there is never a point where that arrow is on that line perfectly, right? How are you going to get perfect accuracy if the arrow never is on your zero, right? It's never zeroed. It's never actually accurate. And if you split the difference and sort of go in the middle of that, then sometimes it's low, sometimes it's high. It may be an acceptable amount of low or high based on your hunting distances, right? You might kill every animal you ever shoot at, but if you're low or high, you're never what? You're never accurate. You're never precise. And what I want is pinpoint accuracy. I want perfect accuracy, the best that I can do in a 60-yard backyard. Gives me the greatest chance of my arrow being dead on perfect. in the woods. I strive for perfect accuracy. Number of ways to get that: know your yardages, use a speed ring scope. That's one great way. Another great way, the Burris Oracle X, a more modern scope with a rangefinder built in. That way you know your distance, and it's factored into your reticle. It's factored into your aiming point on the scope. The HHA optimizer or a turret on a Husqvarna scope, those are great tools if you know the yardage and you dial it in and you get good with that equipment, then it's perfect. I'm not saying you can't make this work, but it's just not for me. It's not part of the Death by Bunjie crossbow hunting method, for what that's worth. I recommend people always get their own hunting method, right? You can read this book and adopt some of it into your own method, or none of it, or all of it. But you got to find what works for you. You got to work with your equipment and know your equipment. This was an interesting video, I think. Thank you for the comment, Jeff Hayes. And until next time, all hail Bunjie.